Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. It is my great pleasure today to invite Keith Bradley. Keith Bradley is the Eli J. and Helen Shaheen Professor of Classics, Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame, and an adjunct professor in Greek and Roman Studies at the University of Victoria. Keith Bradley is going to be talking about his new book, Yourcenar's Hadrian. Please take it away, Keith.
Okay, are we ready? Okay. Good morning, everyone. I would say good morning because I'm speaking to you from the Pacific coast of Canada, where it's still pretty early in the morning. I know it's much later for most of you, but I hope we'll have an interesting time together for the next hour or so. What I want to do today is just give you a more or less informal summary or reflection on how I came to write this book on Marguerite Yourcenar and her portrayal of Hadrian in her novel, Memoirs of Hadrian. There won't be time, obviously, enough to go through all the details that are involved. So this is very much a personal reflection and summary of how I became interested in Yourcenar and what I hope the book achieves in some way, or at least I want to try to explain to you what I hope to have achieved in the book. I'm sure everyone knows that the Memoirs of Hadrian is one of the most celebrated historical novels of the 20th century. It describes the life story of Hadrian, the emperor who ruled Rome's empire from 117 to 138. And it's written in an unusual way, of course, because it doesn't just give a cradle to grave account of Hadrian's life, but begins with Hadrian on his deathbed, recounting his life story in the form of a letter that he writes to the very young Marcus Aurelius, who's a teenager at the time. And the book begins with a set of reflections on Hadrian's part. He knows that the end of life is close at hand. So he muses at the beginning of the story on the meaning of life, essentially, but then suddenly decides that he will tell Marcus the whole of his life story. And he produces this in the form of the letter, which is the principal form that the novel actually takes place. The book was composed in French, of course, between 1949 and 1951. It was published in 1951, in December, right at the end of that year. And at that time, Marguerite Yourcenar was living in the United States. She had come to America when World War II broke out, principally not simply to escape perhaps from the dangers of war in Europe, but also to join the woman, the American woman, who was to become her lifetime, not just translator, but her lifetime companion. And together, that is Grace Frick, and together they eventually settled and lived together in the state of Maine, in the town of Northeast Harbor. And it is still possible to visit the residence that they shared there at times. And it has, in fact, been my good fortune to visit that place and to see Marguerite Yourcenar's library for myself. The publication of the book led to instant fame, of course, and it made Yourcenar's name totally celebrated. And it was from that beginning that she became one of the greatest literary celebrities of her age. How did I come to be interested in this book? Well, I first read it, I think, in the 1980s, but I have absolutely no recollection of what I thought about it at that time. So it was quite serendipitous, really, that some 20 years or so later, I read it again when I was teaching at Notre Dame a series of graduate seminars on the theme of literary responses to the rise of autocracy in the Roman world. And I thought from the students' point of view that it might be an interesting idea to find a modern literary work that would show how a modern author had responded to the imperial autocracy of the Roman Principate. So I read the Memoirs of Hadrian again, and I have to say at that time it was something of almost a surreal experience because I suddenly came to see that on almost every page of the novel, there was some classical allusion or reference to something from classical literature that seemed to give the story a true authenticity. That is to say, it seemed to present a true historical life of Hadrian. And this really captured my imagination because I thought, well, if I'm right in thinking that there is something that one can call genuine and authenticity to this story, how seriously should we take it as a work that is not just a work of novelistic fiction, but is it something that we can actually consider a realistic life of a Roman emperor? And so I thought at first from a possible research point of view that maybe one way to tackle this would be to think in terms of an article of conventional 25 or 30 pages of length in which I compared Yourcenar's treatment of Hadrian with the treatment of Hadrian in conventional historical writing. But very quickly, I found out that that was a complete, not waste of time, but a dead end. It wasn't going to get me very far because in order to do that, I had to learn much more about Yourcenar herself. And once I opened what became an enormous can of worms, as it were, I discovered that she was a far more complicated person than I had ever realized in the past, a more accomplished writer than I'd ever known in the past, and that there was much more in her work as a whole about Hadrian that I needed to research first of all before I could even think of trying to say something as a scholar about the quality of what she had written in the novel. The prime motivation, I suppose, all the time was to wonder, as I'd been thinking about in connection with some other work, my work on Apuleius, what is the connection between fiction and history? Is it possible to use fiction in some way as a genuine historical source? And so that was always in the back of my mind as I started to investigate Yourcenar and her productivity and the records that were available um, that were germane to understanding how she had come to write this novel and what she proposed or had proposed to do with it. So one of the things I discovered was that there was a whole series of volumes in which you could read her published correspondence through much of her life. and that there were also volumes published in which collected interviews that she had given through the course of her life to various media outlets and newspapers and journals, in which she explained precisely what her views about Hadrian were and what she had tried to do in the novel. So to work through all of this, huge volumes of materials, they come, I'm just going to hold one up in case you can see, huge volumes of thousands of pages of letters and interviews in which you can see her writing to, in the sense, letters of fan mail to people who wrote to her about what she'd written, what she thought she had actually done in the novel. At the same time, as I investigated further and further, I saw that there was something that I will call a Yourcenarian tradition of French literary scholarship that I had known nothing about originally. And this also required immense amounts of time to see what critics had, literary critics as opposed to historians, had said about the memoirs. And the result of this was a kind of dilemma. On the one hand, historians said, oh, this is just a novel, it's just fiction, and it's full of mistakes and errors. You can't possibly believe that this is something that we as historians of the Roman Empire, can take seriously. I felt there that, well, the historians have never read all this stuff that I've read about Yourcenar and don't really understand what it is that she was trying to do. On the other hand, I found that the Yourcenarian critics, who were very sensitive to the literary brilliance of Yourcenar, thought that what she had written in the book was the absolute gospel truth about Hadrian, that there was absolutely no reason to question the historical details that she'd put in there at all, and that the thing was entirely credible. So there was a dilemma I could see here, because how did you reconcile the views of historians who pilloried the novel with the critics who held it up as one of the greatest achievements of all literary time? And it took me a long time to sort of figure out an angle, as it were, from which I might be able to say something about the novel that would, if not reconcile, find a solution to the dilemma, at least say something to the two audiences, the historians on the one hand and the literary critics of Yourcenar on the other, that would make each other intelligible to themselves. Well, having set up the problem, I thought, how exactly am I going to do this? And what struck me was that in some of her letters, in response to people who had written to her about it, she described the book, Memoirs, as a historical biography. And of course, it's obvious that in a sense it is set up from the very beginning as Hadrian's autobiography. He writes the story himself. So I began to think that, well, maybe this is the avenue into which I can proceed and find an answer to the problem that I had identified. Let's approach it as a historical biography and see if we can make sense of it that way. What especially attracted me about this idea was that I'd had a very long interest in historical biography itself from a Roman point of view. And it was an interest that had for many years provoked a certain dissatisfaction, I will call it, when I read the various books of Roman emperors that were written along conventional lines. the dissatisfaction was that I tended to think that when fellow scholars wrote biographies of Caligula or Claudius or Nero or whoever, what was really being given was just a chronography, a cradle to grave chronological account of what happened or might have happened within a given ruler's lifespan. But you didn't really find much presented that said anything about the character or the personality of the ruler involved. And of course, this was easily explicable because the sources that are available for the lives of the emperors, as you will all know, are very incomplete and very unsatisfactory in many ways. Often we don't even know precisely what the true factual basis of a given emperor's reign was like. If I take a simple illustration, I just ask, who actually believes, or how can we actually believe that it was Nero himself who decided to set the great fire of Rome in 64? We will never know whether he was directly responsible, what his motivations were, why it happened in the way that it did, and so on. And this sense of dissatisfaction that had been building in me for a long time as I read imperial biography was exacerbated when, in connection with the project that I'd set myself, I decided that I really should explore the history of biography as a literary genre within the contemporary world and read as much modern biography as I possibly could in order to help with this problem of evaluating the memoirs as a true biographical endeavor. So, although I had begun my professional life by working with Suetonius, an author with whom I'm still engaged on several projects at the moment, I found that the real turning point in the history of modern biography had come not from an ancient impulse, but it really come from the eminent Victorians of Lytton Strachey at the beginning of the 20th century, supported in fact by some essays from his coeval Virginia Woolf, and that from a modern point of view, the true biography, as I want to keep calling it, had to say not just what had happened in a given emperor's life, which is what conventional Roman imperial biographies tended to do, but to create a sense of a real personality so that we could understand the psychology to some degree, the emotional life of the biographical subject. And this I learned from reading, especially some of the great contemporary, largely British biographers, A.N. Wilson, Jonathan Bate, and especially Hermione Lee, who I came to understand is the kind of doyenne of modern biographical accomplishments and modern biographical studies. And once I saw that this was a body of work with which I could work, then my sense of understanding memoirs as a true biography started to fall into place. If there's time in the discussion afterwards, I will actually quote to you an extract from a modern Roman biography that will illustrate the problems of dissatisfaction that I've been summarizing in the last few minutes, but I will leave that for a later point for the moment. The acute familiarity, the acute problem that came out of this, of course, was that on the one hand, Hadrian is a very familiar figure. If I just ask you as an audience to say, if I mention Hadrian, what immediately comes into your mind? Well, you will say things like, okay, Hadrian's Wall in Britain, the Pantheon that he is supposed to have been responsible for founding, the Castel, the great fortress in Rome that was his monumental tomb, and you will think of Tivoli and Antinous. So on the one hand, Hadrian seems a very familiar figure and someone whose biography could easily be written. But on the other hand, when you investigate what source material is actually available, it's so hopelessly inadequate that you want to throw your hands up in despair, or at least that's the way I feel when I look at the sources that are available. Essentially, there are just two, what I will call rubbishy sources that are available. One is the short biography that is the first imperial life in this very strange collection that we call today the Historia Augusta, which probably belongs to the 4th century, centuries, that is to say, after the time of Hadrian himself. Who wrote it, what its purpose is, how reliable it is, are huge problems that no one has been able to satisfactorily resolve. So that's the first difficult source with which to deal. And then the other one is just a few pages in the history of Cassius Dio, who is also writing long after Hadrian himself, but it's an incomplete account because all that exists is a summary of what Dio had written, made by the Byzantine monk Xiphilinus in the 11th century. And that's equally unreliable. We don't know where the information came from, how reliably it was copied, and so on. There are, of course, scattered all the way through classical literature, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of references to Hadrian, but they all tend to be small snippets of information, not extended descriptions of what he was like or what happened in his life or what happened particularly in his reign. So there's a real difficulty for anyone in working with his personal life. And that is true as well of his public life as well. So this compounded the problem even further. How did Yourcenar produce what she actually produced? Well, we can think, first of all, about the picture that she actually gives of him. Essentially, he's portrayed as a liberal, humane pacifist who is devoted to public service and the promotion, the universal promotion throughout the empire of what we can call an enlightened Hellenism. Yourcenar seized on the term Graeculus that appears in the Augustan histories account of Hadrian, and everyone remembers him as a devotee of Greek culture. And she saw this as a kind of key to understanding Hadrian as an individual, as a man, as well as an emperor. Her vision was controlled by circumstances, and here I draw on records that she herself has left in her correspondence and interviews. Her point of view was controlled by the time in which the novel was written, between 1941 and 1951, a time which she saw as a euphoric moment in world history. Immediately after World War II, There was hope in the Western world, at least, of a new beginning. It was a time when the United Nations was brought into existence, and she was very influenced by the figures of Dag Hammarskjöld and Adjunct, some of the early leaders in the United Nations. And she'd been very impressed by Churchill's leadership during World War II. And to some extent, she linked all of these figures together in her mind as kind of models for enlightened world rule, people who at least could encourage enlightened world rule, and so saw this construct as a way of leading her to produce the version, the portrait of Hadrian that actually comes out in the novel. A few years after the novel was complete, she abandoned that position entirely. She became extremely pessimistic about the state of the world subsequently. But that was one of the initial motivations for the result of the portrait in the book as we actually have it. Organizationally, she structured her story, the autobiography of Hadrian that he writes in his letter, around three key episodes that can be identified historically. None of them is known terribly well, but she made them the key points in the narrative, not just because they seem to have been important factually as historical events, but also because they were ways in which she could find, she thought, the emotional consequences behind them, what they meant for Hadrian as an individual, what his personal emotional response to them was. So the three elements are, first, the accession of Hadrian, whether he was ever going as a young man to become the successor to Trajan was something that could not be directly expected. You remember that Trajan, at the end of his life, was fighting a war in the Near East against the Parthian Empire. And he dies there in 117, 118 on campaign. And Yourcenar uses this build-up from Hadrian's point of view to try to figure out what he was feeling when he doesn't know whether he is ever going to be the successor he seems to be to Hadrian, and what the great release of emotion actually is when when Trajan dies, and Hadrian realizes that yes, he will be the Roman emperor, something that he's been hoping for decades previously. The second episode is the story of his relationship with Antinous, about whom practically nothing credible is really known. The sources on Antinous are just so slender that it's impossible even to say when Hadrian first met Antinous. All that's really known about him is that there was some relationship of some kind, that Antinous drowned in the river Nile, and that he was deified by Hadrian afterwards. Much more, art historians would say, can be known about Antinous from the sculptures and the portraits that remain after him, rather than from literary sources. But Yourcenar took the remnants of the tradition about Hadrian Antinous and made them into a tragic love story, a story of a homoerotic relationship, which brought, on the one hand, while it was in full bloom, great happiness to Hadrian. But when Antinous died by drowning, took him to the absolute depths of despair. from which it seemed he might never immediately recover. And then the third crisis around which the novel as a whole is structured concerns the great Jewish war that occurred towards the end of Hadrian's reign, when the great peacemaker, as Yourcenar believed he really truly wanted to be, had to fight a war that involved the destruction of Jerusalem and terrible consequences for much of the Jewish population. This was a tragic failure, it seemed to her, that had huge emotional consequences for Hadrian and drove him into a period at the end of his life of, if not complete breakdown. He still managed to conduct business as the ruler of the Roman Empire, but left him in a personally very weakened state that ultimately produces the picture of him on his deathbed in the novel, where he is writing his memoirs, so that Marcus Aurelius, who eventually will succeed him, can actually learn something, it seems, perhaps, because there is a didactic element to the novel from what he expresses. Well, if those are the three critical episodes in this story, they're matched by what I would call a threefold methodology in which we can see the elements by which Yourcenar actually succeeded in her recreation of these events. First of all, and this is extremely important to know, her knowledge of the ancient sources, as indeed of all classical literature, was absolutely immense. And she controlled those materials in a way that I think even few professional Roman historians have ever done. She was sensitive, of course, to their imperfections, the imperfections both of Cassius Dio's account and of the Historia Augustus account, not to mention all the other just passing allusions to Hadrian that are there within the tradition. But instead of trying to deal with them in the way that historians deal with them, that is to say, by looking at the sources and trying to figure out where the original information came from, instead of applying the techniques of source criticism, she said, well, every item that tells us something about Hadrian's life, I will regard as a memory. She conceived of history generally just as a set of memories. And what she set out to do was to put all these memories together into a kind of mosaic or collage of recollections. And she would use them to give what she thought was the set of recollections that Hadrian himself would have as he looked back on his life. The clever thing, I think, about the way she organized the book as a retrospective account was very brilliant, because Hadrian on his deathbed is a relatively old man. He's in his 60s. And she knew, and this is something that I'm increasingly discovering for myself, now that I myself am an ancient historian, that late in life, you tend to forget a lot of things. I simply do not have the recall on names and dates and facts that I had 20 or 30 years ago. And this is the way Yourcenar conceived of Hadrian with his set of memories. So instead of trying to write a precise, carefully delineated, factually accurate account of the details that could be put together in a cradle-to-grave narrative, Yourcenar was more interested in simply creating from the sources available an older man's impressionistic account of what had happened in his life. And it didn't matter, therefore, if some of the details were a little dubious or memories were a little murky. They all nonetheless figured into the general scheme of remembrance that she thought could be used for her purposes. The second technique that she used was as follows. It's okay to say, well, we know certain things happened factually in Hadrian's lifetime, even if we don't know precisely what his involvement with them was. But how can you possibly say what his emotional personality type responses to them were from his own immediate inner life's point of view? Well, here Yourcenar used the following technique. She thought that human nature was the same from age to age, and that human nature, composed of a set of emotions, were identical in all world history and in all world cultures. And she thought this way because she had read extremely widely in world history and in cultural history, and had something like an anthropologist's understanding of cultural life and the world of human nature that I think few professional historians can actually match. So when she had to deal with the events that she was describing, she wanted to draw on emotions like love or despair or anger or rage, not just because they were feelings that we might understand now in the 20th or now in the 21st century, but because they had always been there, uncontroversially so, since the beginning of time. And it made sense, therefore, that Hadrian could well have responded in the way that he did to the three crises of his reign. All of that is controversial, but I was encouraged to understand sympathetically her point of view because it coincided with what I found Ramsay MacMullen, the great historian of the Roman Empire of our time, had said in his book, Feelings in History. And you will find the reference to that book in my book, and it's something that I would recommend to everyone to read in conjunction with reading the Memoirs of Hadrian. I think it's an important way of validating a lot of what appears in the novel. The final element in Yourcenar's technology or methodology was something more controversial still. And here, all I can do is outline it, describe it, because it's something that surpasses my own individual understanding. This is something that she called sympathetic magic, magie sympathique. And what it means, as I understand it, is that she believed that she had, as a literary artist, as someone who I think myself was of genius capability, a capability in the form almost of entrancement to enter into a kind of spiritual communion with the figure of Hadrian as she conceived and imagined him. And in her personal records, these are records that are not completely publicly available, she actually writes of occasions when she was composing the novel where she felt the presence of Hadrian actually with her, almost in a physical sense. And she identified with the feelings in these great crises that she herself was projecting onto him as she composed her novel. Now, I can't say that I have ever experienced um, something of that sort, but I do not doubt that the great artist can have experiences of such a kind. I read just the other night that Milton, for instance, was supposed to have had visions of a comparable kind when he was writing Paradise Lost. So I'm not discounting this at all. I'm simply saying that it's something that most of us would probably not say that we could identify with ourselves. On the other hand, one reason why I'm prepared to believe that Yourcenar wasn't simply making all of this up was because the account of her experiences seemed to me to coincide exactly what I had learned from another great Roman historian and someone with whom I had a very fine friendship for many years before his far too premature death. And that was what Keith Hopkins called empathetic imagination. He was very much an advocate of the notion that we as historians had to try to identify as closely as we possibly could in an empathetic way with the subjects of the protagonists, the historical protagonists of our work. And so, in the way that human nature and Ramsay MacMullen coincided, so sympathetic magic and Hopkins's empathetic imagination seem to give some validity to what I'm calling the technology or the methodology that Yourcenar used to create a novel. So I could say much more, of course, about some of the things that resulted from what she did. But let me just summarize so that there will be time for some discussion and questions, and I can work perhaps some further points into my answers to questions later. My conclusion has become something like as follows, that I believe that despite the factual errors that are in the novel, as a whole, Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian is as successful a biography, a genuine biography of a Roman emperor as could possibly have been composed at the time that it was written. It can't be accepted today, right now, at the moment I'm speaking, as factually authoritative, because since Yourcenar wrote, there have been new discoveries, especially of documents and papyri, that affect the chronology, for instance, of Hadrian's reign. But as an authentic portrait of a human individual, I want to contend, and I hope you will read the book and ultimately agree with me, that the book works as a Roman imperial biography. The culmination, and this I think is a point, and this is my last point for the moment, the final point that I want to make in the book is that I think that what Yourcenar finally did with the book was insert herself into what I'm going to call the Roman Latin biographical exemplary tradition. And I say that because you will all know that history in antiquity was meant not just to record the past, but to teach readers about how to live their lives and how to conduct their fortunes in the present and the future. And what happens in the memoirs, as we learn from Hadrian's letter, is that over time he comes to reflect on his own life more and more and to achieve something that Yourcenar calls sagesse, wisdom. Her book, therefore, has a very heavily didactic character to it. And what it does is encourage ultimately everyone, not just to learn about Hadrian, but to reflect on yourself, the reader, and to learn from Hadrian's experience what wisdom you yourself might ultimately acquire in the form, that is to say, of self-knowledge. So I will pause there for a moment. I think I've slightly exceeded my time, but I hope that what I've said might have been of some interest to you as far as Yourcenar's great novel is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it looks like we already have one question, and yeah, if anyone else wants to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And otherwise you can, if you're having trouble finding the raise hand feature, we'll find another way to call on you. You could write in the chat or something. So the first question is Manu.
Thank you for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Fine. Yes.
Good, good. You will count me, I'm afraid, among your unsympathetic listeners. And that is, I think I have really quite serious methodological questions about how you went about this, because it seems to me that you responded to the novel because she is a supreme novelist, and you felt that she got things right, and then succumbed to the urge to protect her from the criticisms of the professional historians. Now, she was not trying to write a professional history, even though clearly from what you tell us, she had the training and the capacities to do so. But that was not her aim. And it just seems to me that the extent of the empathetic imagination, it comes up, one ends up with what is ultimately a personal and subjective response to a work of fiction, to a work of literature. And I'm actually sympathetic to your own initial response, because when I read Alexei, which I read rather lazily in English and not in French, as a gay man, I wondered, how could she get this so exactly right? And then I realized that my error was bound up in some way without my realizing it with identity politics, and that I wasn't accepting the fact that her capacity of imagination vastly surpassed mine. And so my surprise that she was able to put herself in the shoes of a gay man that was what the surprise was. Whereas I shouldn't have been surprised at all. I should have simply said, what a genius. She's able to present something that seems to me absolutely right. And I think you have fallen into the same error. And that at the end of the day, what one needs is a series, a listing of whatever sources there are that can lay any light on Hadrian's life. And I think that the kind of biography that you want simply cannot be done because there aren't enough sources. And I think one needs to simply then accept that the sources aren't there to write the kind of biography that I want to read. And so I think there's a little too much pleading for accepting a work of fiction as something that is, that has value in the eyes of professional historians, when that's not what she was trying to do.
I take your point. I don't accept it, of course. But so let me respond. I'll pick up on two terms, perhaps. One is pleading. I don't want the book to be an apologia. My object was to, as I tried to make clear at the beginning, to respond to two audiences and to explain to each one the problems that each set has in approaching the novel. So I think at the end, I say to my two audiences, I want you to know this, and I want you to know that. So that was the kind of objective purpose in what I've written. If it doesn't convince you, that's fine. But I would ask you simply to recognize that the object was explanatory in the first instance, so that historians could learn something about the literary approach to the novel as a work of art, and the literary people could see something of the problems involved in writing a biography of Hadrian. Now, I agree that it is impossible in an Hermione Lee case example to write a biography of Hadrian. I am not suggesting, as I just concluded by saying, that the book can be read now as a definitive biography of Hadrian. That is not at all the case. I maintain nonetheless that from the manner in which Yourcenar herself conceived of it and went about producing it, that it can be understood in the terms that she used of a biographical narrative that she constructed in a way that makes structural sense. So yes, we're all the victims of the projects that perhaps that we want to undertake. And I appreciate your comments, but I cannot say more than that at the moment, but might return to it a little later if we have time. Okay? I know that won't satisfy you, but perhaps we can have a longer discussion later.
Sure.
Thank you. Ben?
Right. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. Very fascinating.
Okay,
I
thank
have
you.
two brief questions. The first one is, how would you compare Yourcenar's work with the work of an ancient historiographer such as Herodotus? I know it's a different genre of writing, like historiography versus a biography or memoir, but in some way they're using it. It seems to me that they're using it in sort of a didactic function. They have an imperfect level of source material, but they present it in through a certain lens and mechanism in which they present what the material as it's understood to them, and they both compose it in a certain way to make a larger didactic point. For Herodotus, obviously, cyclical nature of history, and for Yourcenar, composing what is known, what she was familiar with the chronology of Hadrian's life, as it was familiar to her, in arranging it in a pattern of the narrative that she presents with the three arcs, with the Ascension, Antinous, tragedy, and then the destruction of Jerusalem. So,
Right.
sort of taking what was familiar to both authors and then rearranging it into a way to be sort of a didactic teaching moment for their audiences. Neither one is modern historiography, but in some ways, but in other ways, it does present itself as a type of history or historiography. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that type of comparison.
Well, of course, that's complicated and immense. I think one thing to say, or one point to underline, is that her knowledge of classical literature was absolutely immense. One of the ways that can be understood is by looking at her collection, this book, La Couronne et la Lyre, The Crown and the Lyre, which is a translation of Greek poetry from Homer all the way up into Byzantine Greek sources. I mean, she began to learn Greek when she was 10 years old as a child who her father had taken to London when World War I had broken out. And she began to learn Greek as her father read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius to her, which to me is the most obvious way to start learning Greek. But she knew Greek and Latin thoroughly and had read everything in sight. So she was fully aware that the didactic tradition of historiography was there immutably so. Now, I can't prove by pointing to something that she wrote that says, I set out in the novel to teach the reader in the way that Herodotus or Livy or whoever set out to teach his reading audience. But she's so fulsome in the commentary and her correspondence and her interviews that the ultimate goal of the novel is for the protagonist to get to to get as close as possible to what she calls wisdom. She says that Hadrian became almost wise at the end of his life, that the connection is unmistakable, I think, that she took this from the tradition, maybe not consciously, but that is a result, I think, that a consequence that happens. She couldn't really take that from the biographical tradition in antiquity, because as far as I can see, the biographical tradition, both in Greek and Latin literature, never became as strong as the purely historiographical tradition. Plutarch says that he's writing biography to show some signs of the soul. That ties in with what Yourcenar does in this novel, because in a sense she's showing his emotions, which are signs of something that you could call his soul, if you want to use that word. But we would have to pursue a great deal of time with the researchers of Mamigliano, for instance, to wonder whether biography in antiquity ever achieved anything comparable to what we expected to achieve and what it often does achieve today with some of those exponents I referred to at the beginning of my talk. So I'm not sure I can say more about that again right now, but it's obviously an interesting subject and topic to think about. So thank you.
Thank you. I had a quick other question, if that's okay,
Sure.
about the contemporary events that were happening during Yourcenar's life, in particular World War II, as well as her sexual orientation,
Yes.
or what is known of it, and how that would have affected her portrayal of Hadrian. Would that have allowed her to focus on particular interests, in terms of like focusing on adding more detail to the relationship between Hadrian and Antinous as she presents? Or
Well, again, there's a lot that can be said about that, because she was in early life, from all that can be recovered of her life, bisexual, but then spent the large portion of her life in a lesbian relationship with Grace Frick. Sexuality was obviously something of great importance to her. And one of the things that I discovered, I was not the first to know this, but it was one of the things that I discovered myself, was that in her private records, which are held at Harvard, you can see that she had carefully studied the Kinsey report, and she made notes on what she thought were the sexual identities of any number of figures from the Roman past. So this was always something of consuming interest to her. One of the things I didn't have time to talk about in the main portion of what I was speaking about was that when she reinvented the story of Antinous, she was very heavily influenced by a predecessor whose name was John Addington Symonds, and he was a Victorian British man of letters, we would call him today. He was a historian, an art historian, a poet, and he had on the surface a conventional heterosexual family life, but he was gay. And he had a very sad life, ultimately, in the end, I feel. But he wrote about Antinous. He wrote a lot about Greek literature. He wrote a lot on Greek lyric poetry, for instance. It's extremely perceptive. Yourcenar drew on his studies, and I think you can show she identifies him, first of all, as one of the sources that she had read. But when she, when you look in detail at the connection between them, I think it's true to say that not least through his assistance, she understood the nature of Greek homoeroticism as we tend to understand it today, but much earlier than mainstream classical scholars had done. I think she was ahead of her time in that way, and that's one of the points I make in the book. So I'm sure you're right in thinking that somehow that is implicit in what she says about Antinous. But of course, it's a question that you could only definitively answer if we had her here to interview. And as with everything else, what I've done is purely inferential from the records that remain. So I'd recommend pursuing Symonds if you're at all interested in this. And I will say, just as a personal note, that one of the most interesting experiences I've had with this was I was so intrigued when I was working on this portion of the book that I really wanted to see Symonds's burial place, which is in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. And I went there once, again, many years ago now. It took forever to find. And when I found it, it was a little, not disappointing, but sad, because it was overgrown. No one had cared for it in recent times. But it was wonderful to see the inscription recording his life, honoring his life, that had been composed by no less a figure than Benjamin Jowett. And that should give you something to think about. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Kane?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Marvelous. Number one, thank you so much for the talk. This has been absolutely fascinating, and it was very eloquently delivered. My question was somewhat answered already by the previous one, but still, if there's anything additional you wanted to say about it, I'd be very curious to hear. And what I wanted to ask is a little bit tripartite, so I'll get on with it. So I'd be interested to hear you talk a bit more about Yourcenar's construction of Antinous, perhaps your reaction to it, as the sources on him are so scanty, as well as how she depicts his relationship with Hadrian. And then finally, the impact of her depiction of their relationship and Antinous, how those two figures have been received by the modern queer community.
Well, let me just briefly take the final point first. I can't speak with great authority on this, but my understanding is that Antinous has become iconic within the queer community. From some of the reading I've done, that seems to be self-evident. This is a case where I'm having a senior moment and not remembering the name of an author of an article that I use extensively in the book, but I can give it to you later if you want to correspond with me. But it becomes clear from this particular reference that there is a sort of following of Antinous and Hadrian within that particular social category. I cannot say more than that because that's simply all I know. As for the portrayal in the book, I think what I would say, well, what I do say, and I don't think this is really arguable, she portrays in the narrative a relationship that shows a complete understanding of the homoerotic Greek relationship as it seems to be communicated to us in the main sources. That I think is inarguable. On the emotional side, it's what I called a love story before, but it's not a love story that is sentimental and of the Harlequin romance type, obviously. It has many, many different dimensions. There is something that I think all of us can understand as deep passion involved, but there are also moments when Hadrian is very cruel to Antinous and is almost despising him and treating him very harshly. This is all invented, of course, but the relationship is multifaceted. But somehow he identifies Antinous as the supreme love object, a figure of great beauty. But the tragic element starts to arise as Antinous matures and loses the attractiveness, the physical attractiveness of his teenage years. Now, this cannot be historically true because not enough is known about the relationship from the fragments of information that we have. So clearly, Yourcenar is injecting or projecting much here. But in the way that she portrays Hadrian, despite what I'll call the bad parts, as nurturing him into someone who will become as educated and sophisticated as he believes himself to be, fully Greek. There is something, I think, that is very moving about that. And even more so when she describes his response to Hadrian's death. There is a phrase in the Augustan biography of Hadrian where the author says that when Antinous died, Hadrian wept like a woman. And in the Latin, it's not really a complimentary statement at all. It's quite the reverse, because to be womanish for a man is Greek and Roman terms, obviously not a good thing. But she took that phrase, which was very important to John Adjunct Simons, for instance. He emphasizes it too in what he wrote about Antinous. She develops that to create what she believed to be the sense of tragedy that Hadrian felt when Antinous dies, with the knowledge, which of course no one can know for certain, that he himself might have been responsible for the death. But no one will ever know the truth about this because we simply do not know exactly what happened at that time on the Nile in Egypt when Antinous somehow found himself in the water and never returned. I don't know if that answers everything that you brought up, but I think that's, again, all I can say for the moment.
Yes, that was brilliant. Thank you. And then
Thank you.
if I might actually ask one more question that I just remembered,
Sure.
are you familiar with Rufus Wainwright's opera Hadrian? I believe initially produced in 2019 or 2020, which says that it drew a lot of inspiration from Yourcenar's novel.
The answer is yes, but I don't really know anything about it. I know that it existed, if not still exists, but it's not something I've investigated. It was impossible to do everything if I was ever going to finish the project at all, which, as you might well have gathered, took me something like 20 years on and off to get through. But one comment I will make, and I don't know how relevant this is to the Wainwright thing, but while Yourcenar was alive, there were several approaches to her to produce either theatrical or operatic versions of the story of Hadrian, and particularly with regard to Antinous. She encouraged some of them, but was very skeptical. I mean, she was always skeptical about most things, as you probably gathered this morning. She was very skeptical about them, and ultimately did not want anything to happen at all. So how she might have reacted to this, of course, no one will ever know, but I suspect that she would have been very unsupportive, if not openly suspicious. I think probably because she would have felt the intensity of feeling that she recovers in the book could not truly be captured in a short theatrical or operatic performance. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Kane. Do we have any other questions? Okay, if not, I just want to thank Keith Bradley once again for coming and sharing all of this wonderful knowledge in your talk with us today. And I hope that everybody has a great afternoon. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much to everyone involved. It was a pleasure to be spending some time with you. I'm now going to recompose myself and watch the Notre Dame football game. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.